Certainly, we would not expect publicly to have an announcement or a joint statement or anything like that. Analysts tend to think that this trip to the United States, which already featured a meeting with a top House Democrat on the first stopover in New York, and we now have this more significant meeting with the House Speaker, a Republican, Kevin McCarthy, in LA, that this trip is actually more about Tsai Ing-Wen trying to cement cross-party, bipartisan support in the US ahead of the election in Taiwan early next year and somebody else taking over the presidential role. She obviously hopes that it will be someone from her own party, the DPP. The current Vice President, William Lai, is almost certain to be the nominee on that side of Taiwanese politics. But even if it is a president elected from the main opposition, KMT, despite very different politics, I think Tsai Ing-Wen, with this US trip, wants to leave to her successor a pretty strong foundation of Taiwan-US ties. And we've already seen that last year here in Taipei with the then Democrat House Speaker Nancy Pelosi making an historic visit here. Now she's doing not quite as sensitive because it's on American soil, but nonetheless a very significant meeting with the Republican House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy. So you can see, even if there isn't anything particularly concrete to come out of these meetings, it at very least leaves a sort of setup and a legacy for the next Taiwan president to deal with.
Yeah. Well, the last time, of course, when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, Beijing responded furiously, really flying sorties very close to Taiwan, really sort of pushing the boundaries in terms of their presence around Taiwan. You know, right now, though, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, as well as the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, they're both visiting China. How do you think that visit is going to be construed in the light of what's happening in the US?
Well, the point that a lot of people are making is when you have Macron and the EU chief in Beijing, or they're visiting other places too, like Guangzhou, but in China, meeting Xi, it should, in theory, make it more difficult for Xi Jinping to launch a large-scale military intimidation exercise against Taiwan, just because it's rather a sensitive thing to do when you have prominent European leaders that you're hosting in China at the time. That doesn't mean that it will stop him necessarily, but some analysts suspect that perhaps China may wait until after Macron has left China before we see some sort of repeat of the military drills that Beijing launched last year when Nancy Pelosi was here. Although, Bev, I've got to say, the expectation is, because this meeting with McCarthy is happening on American soil, because McCarthy is not from the governing White House party in the US, there is a general expectation that however China chooses to respond militarily, it may not be quite as dramatic as it was last year. And if you remember, last year, among other things, included a sort of partial blockade and missiles being fired around and even over Taiwan.
Yeah. Just on the visit from Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, do you think they'll get much of a hearing in terms of China not supporting Russia, providing sort of military support for Russia?
Well, the French position appears to be that Macron will say if China does more to use its influence on Vladimir Putin's Russia to try and bring an end to the conflict, then France could try to resist American efforts to force European partners to decouple their economies from China. Now, no one's saying that France or Germany or EU countries would completely be planning to cut off their extensive trade links with Beijing, but there's obviously pressure from the Biden White House to try and get European allies to take a more sceptical line towards China, and that would include scaling down some of the economic cooperation, particularly on things like sensitive technology. So there is a school of thought, Bev, that the French leader will try and bring that as a carrot to Xi Jinping and say, look, if you do more to put pressure on Vladimir Putin, then we here in France will do more to resist US pressure to try and scale down the economic relationship with China. Whether or not that has much impact or much meaning for Xi Jinping, well, we don't know. But remember, all this talk about China providing Russia with arms or with ammunition, it is something that certainly Ukraine and its NATO partners fear, but so far we really aren't seeing any substantial evidence of China doing that.
Yeah. Talking of technology, Bill, you know, China has rebuked Australia over its governmental ban on TikTok, which is really just following many other countries. How strong a rebuke is this, given the relationship between the two countries seems to be improving a little?
Not that strong. I mean, India has banned TikTok completely. Here in Taiwan, they have banned TikTok from government devices. The US has banned it from government devices and is considering a broader ban, and looks quite likely it could actually happen at some point. Britain, New Zealand, other Five Eyes countries, they have banned TikTok from government devices. I don't think the Chinese government would be particularly surprised by Australia's actions at all. Also, too, the Albanese government has indicated that a broader ban is something that's not being considered. That, I think, China would regard as far more significant. You always have to look at the context here. China's government has banned basically every major American social media outlet, whether it's Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, WhatsApp. All these have been banned or barred in China for a long time. So, you know, there's this huge element of hypocrisy in the whole thing. But certainly from a diplomatic perspective, China's foreign ministry yesterday criticised the Albanese government's move, saying that countries should not broaden the use of national security as an excuse to pressure and restrict foreign companies. Given that China has done this to so many international tech companies, particularly American ones, it's probably water off a duck's back. But nonetheless, it is something interesting given that Australia and China are trying to improve their relationships.
Yes, lots of double standards, Bill, when it comes to those relations. Good to see you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Bev.